Just very briefly, the Federal Reserve has been doing what you say the mandate of the Bank of Canada is. Ever since this crisis, the World Central Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve of the United States has been doing exactly what you say the mandate of the Bank of Canada is. It's been buying government debt. And that's how it's been refloating the banking system. You know, if someone had said that, or those who did say it, anytime in the last 30 years, would have been accused of gross economic illiteracy for making such a suggestion. Right? The dollar would collapse, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the problem is what the United States can do, because it is the center of global capitalism, because the American empire is seen by all capitalists around the world as the ultimate defender of private property, as the safest place to put your investment in a crisis, even when the United States is in a crisis itself. The United States can do this despite the size of its trade deficit, despite the size of its fiscal deficit, and any other state in the world can't. I'm not, probably even Germany couldn't right now, but arguably they're the only other one that might. You know, it's certainly not impossible to see a central bank playing that role. It's very difficult to see it playing that role without it leading on to an enormous confrontation with capital, especially a finance-led global capital. Because they would see that the central bank is playing the role in doing so of not being a defender of the primacy of privately held government debt. The reason that the banks are calling for austerity everywhere is that they want to make sure that if there's any money in the kitty goes to paying off the private bondholders. Okay? That it's not used to fund infrastructure building. And it is certainly the case, and there's no question about it, that in a country like Greece, but in most others, a massive reflation of the currency, of the money supply, and a deflation of the currency would probably be inflationary. And you know, there would be a danger of having to buy bread with bucket loads of drachma, and people are afraid of this. So Sam and I argue that the primary cause of the inflation that caused the crisis of the 70s was full employment, wage pressure from below, the strength of social movements and unions. There was an inflationary push coming from below. But it doesn't only have to happen that way. And you can also print money in order to try to pay for oil that way. But then the value of your currency isn't going to be worth much. So, I think this is not a bad proposal, but it's like every other, it's a technocratic one. It's a technocratic one, and those people who propose this in Canada tend to be policy wonks. They don't tend to be the type of people who look at the political balance of forces, don't look at the broader context of the struggle of classes domestically and internationally, etc. They're looking for a magic bullet that either Keynes didn't have or Friedman doesn't have, and I think that doesn't take us very far. It's not to say it's impossible to do, and the Federal Reserve is doing it. But you need to understand that in a much broader context, I think, politicized and class analysis concept. Syriza has a long litany of proposals for creating jobs, and they speak in terms of, explicitly, in terms of social enterprises. They also speak explicitly in terms of them joining to co-op social enterprises, but also big private enterprises, small private enterprises, and above all, public enterprises. And they talk a lot about the types of jobs they ought to be creating, the type of planning they ought to be engaged in, and so on. And one of the serious things about them is they ask whether we now have the capacities really to do that. Do the people in social enterprises now really have the capacities to create hundreds of thousands of jobs? Do they have the ambition? Do they have the capacities? Do they have the knowledge? And they even do that around, you know, cooperative enterprises that are doing support work, let us say, with the disabled, getting them involved in productive work. Do we have the type of expertise there that really can mobilize people to, disabled people to be doing that thing? Don't we need to develop those types of capacities and so on? So that's there, and it's in the program. If I was able to read the 300-page program that came out beginning of 2009, I might be able to tell you more. But in the program that was initiated for post-elections, there are pages of a general kind. We would have infrastructure investment, we would have public enterprises, we would ally with social enterprises and cooperatives, but then they also say small private enterprises and big private enterprises as well, and being fairly vague about what those would be. You know, I think I've spoken to the question of revolution versus reform being understood as insurrection versus parliamentarism, which is the distinction I think that people often fail to make. That it isn't inevitable that a attempt to make revolution through getting into the state peacefully inevitably is reformist in the bad sense of the term. Yes, there was a parliamentary path which was reformist in the sense of not introducing the type of reforms that were structural reforms that had a dynamic in terms of developing people's capacities to go on and make further inroads against capital and transcend capital and develop people's ability to do that and the parties' ability to do that. Sure. And there'll be a strong tendency in Syriza that will be frightened of the charge that's made in today's Financial Times, if anybody looked at it, which is that there are old-fashioned revolutionaries inside Syriza. Right? And we'll have to see whether Syriza is now going to marginalize them. Right? They say admittedly they're a minority, so they give them that much credit. That's the serious European press. Right? They're only a minority than Syriza of old-fashioned revolutionaries. Now, you know, I think of the old-fashioned and they are there. There are people inside Syriza who are in favor of pulling out of the euro just as much as Antarsya is, and orient their politics much more to protest than electoralism and so on. But again, it seems to me that they too lack a strategy for affecting a socialist transformation in a way that is not insurrectionary. And I don't see the basis even in Greece for an insurrectionary strategy. So, whether we need to talk about replicating the dilemmas, I think that's true. I hope people don't get bogged down in that. That's not to say that you don't get a certain insight and maybe a certain sympathy for Karl Kautsky or August Bebel or the people who made Red Vienna at the municipal level. You know, a certain sympathy for where they ended up.
But right? Not for Bernstein?
So, you know, I think Bernstein was the least, in a sense, reformist of them because he thought capital was doing this of itself. And it would simply drop these reforms into our lap as it socialized capital, right? So he at least had a strategy. But, you know, I don't think it's bad to read obviously Luxemburg and Lenin and Trotsky against, although, you know, Greg tells me, I haven't read it, that Lee's argument is that Lenin had no difference from Kautsky with regard to party strategy. That's true. It was only the Russian conditions that made a difference, and Russian conditions aren't our conditions. On staying in the euro, you know, a strong internationalist position can be that of staying in the euro and trying to build alliances in Europe as a whole. That said, the way the European Union is structured is so oriented to not allowing for capital controls, so fundamentally oriented above all to the free flow of capital, that it isn't a matter of taking the current institutions and putting in a different set of policies. You're really talking about an entirely different set of international institutions. one that would be oriented to sustaining capital controls that individual countries would introduce. So you are talking about a fundamental shift in class structure through the whole of Europe, and it's not there. So I am very sympathetic to those who would argue that Greece would have to go and try to opt for a shift in the balance of forces that would make it easier to go. That is, putting the kinds of pressure on European governments that would lead them to not make Greek lives so miserable by virtue of them going, which is exactly what Nouriel Roubini, the NYU economist, has been calling for. You don't want a basket case in the Balkans, and you should allow them to go back to the drachma, have a devalued currency, introduce capital controls, but make it easier for them to do so rather than have a Balkan situation all over again in Greece. In terms of plans for mobilizing the left inside Europe, Omir's question, what does that really mean? I mean, no doubt there are some discussions amongst anarchist groups, and I've met Greek anarchists who are really impressive cadres. And they are well enough organized and disciplined to have engaged in no disruptive activities during the entire electoral period. Can you imagine the kind of effect they could have had, right? The kind of symbolic point they could have made about the emptiness of electorates, about the rottenness of the state, etc., right? Had they done this in terms of their symbolic politics. And they didn't. It was very disciplined. And most people thought that most anarchists voted Syriza. That said, you can imagine discussions that they ought to have more common protests, attend each other's protests, and that could have some effect in terms of the balance of forces. But I think on the whole it would be quite marginal. The type of alliances, the kinds of shifts in the balance of forces that Syriza has intended during this electoral period has mainly involved them going to Germany, hosted by the left party in Germany, being very public about that meeting, and having a public meeting as well with the finance spokesman of the SPD, of the Social Democratic Party. They've also had back-channel meetings with official German bureaucrats. Who knows what was discussed at those took place. I imagine they've also had discussions with Social Democrats elsewhere in Europe. One of the very striking things is how appalling the Scandinavians have been with regard to the imposition of austerity on Greece. All these illusions about Sweden and Norway and Finland, they've been the worst. Hey, well, they're just as bad as the Germans in terms of insisting on austerity, in terms of insisting on discipline. And people ought to be aware of that. Very depressing, when I was in Paris for a conference last week, was Sunday's election in France. Here the socialists are elected. A majority on their own in Parliament for the first time since 1981. You wouldn't have known on Sunday there was an election. There's no evidence of it in the streets. Nobody was talking about it. And it really showed the bankruptcy of social democracy, that most people saw this as not going to lead to much, not going to change much. Right? And when you talk to socialists, Marxists, etc., and you said, surely Holland is going to have some effect in terms of softening the Germans, they weren't even discussing it in a serious way amongst themselves. Like, no, that's not what he's about. So, you know, shifting the balance of forces that way is not going to be easy. And I didn't come away optimistic about that at all. In terms of who they mobilized, no, they secured way more than the 4% of the electorate the KKE lost, although they went from 17 to 27. So a piece of that, no doubt, came from the KKE. Antarsya, if it was lucky, it got half of 1% of the vote. I mean, I haven't seen the final figure because it was so minuscule. But in some ways, they did themselves harm, because had they not run, they could have claimed their extent of support was much greater than losing half of the lousy 1.2% of the vote that they had. Right? because nobody would have known the degree of support if they hadn't done. But they got way, way more than that, and they explicitly were oriented at the high number of people who abstained in previous elections, and they clearly got a fair number of people, especially public servants and pensioners, who previously either didn't vote or voted for PASOK or even voted for New Democracy.
About the exit from the euro is that the Communist Party outside the Greek Communist parties up in the rest of Europe are largely not in favor of exit either. And like every other major political force across Europe, every other left party, the Social Democratic parties, the European Trade Union Confederation, they're all arguing along the lines for a European-wide strategy, which is just still very difficult to see, but that's where they are. So any exit strategy is very limited. The main force that has argued for exit has been the UK Socialist Worker Party, which of course then runs up. It's advocating usually the kind of program that usually comes out completely against, which is a left nationalist program of some kind, and also also for a strategy which they would generally call socialism in one country. And so this is the force that's there, and the basis for the exit is very limited. The main person that they've been evoking is Lapavitsas on this, but Lapavitsas, who's developed the main strategy for exit among leftist economists across Europe, he was very strongly in favor of Syriza and has been very strong, but has been doing much what you were speaking about, of advocating a plan B. I just want to make another quick point. Is the other challenge that will come from Syriza now will be that it will start holding elected offices at other levels of government, likely, in the coming periods, which is going to change also the dynamic inside. It's going to start winning, and its cadre are going to start going in. And it is going to, it's the challenge that you put forward is not only the rationalization of a very bankrupt state, it's obviously the question of building and developing a transformative politics that changes that state and its relationship to the people, that deals with, to speak philosophically, the generally alienated structure of bourgeois states. And that'll be the challenge. And it's going to come before the next election, possibly, some of the transformation questions from local and other levels where they will start entering different levels of governmental office. And I think this is almost unavoidable. I think we'll turn it back to you, Leo, for final comments.
Okay. So first of all, I appreciate the comments, both comments on the Kukwe and the KKE. And I have to say that I picked up in Syntagma Square when I went to visit the memorial to the old guy who killed himself. There was a group of very determined and significant group of activists, about 20, with a megaphone, greeting people out and coming up onto the subway. And I immediately went over to see who they were, and they were young activists from the Kukwe, handing out pamphlets. And the pamphlets they were handing out was attacking Syriza. Now you have to remember, if you're saying about calling names, Omar, that it was Syriza who asked the KKE to enter a government. It was the KKE that said, we won't have anything to do with this. Now I can see the logic, because I think there is a danger that a Syriza government, given the forces involved, given the balance of forces inside the party, given the, as you say, amorphous party organization, could get trapped in a project to do what they could inside the state. But the Kukwe project is to issue a set of statements which are almost undifferentiable between before the crisis and the crisis in terms of an attack on capitalism in almost every sense, and precisely to point to things like NATO, which many of the things that you mentioned, Omar, are in the Syriza program. Workers' control, and they are much fudgy. Sure, they fudge things a lot more clearly, but they are actually engaged in a dynamic that, as they put it, is trying to do something for the Greek people in the face of this crisis. That is, it would be irresponsible not to try to form a government in the face of what's happening to Greek people. And the project of the KKE is determinedly not to try to do that in this crisis. As for Cuba and the Mediterranean, you know, Castro was thought by the Cuban communists to be a liberal. And they weren't too enthusiastic through much of the 50s. The new Communist Party that was created was not made up of most of the leading Cuban communists of the 1950s. You'll remember that the Chilean communists weren't too keen on Allende, and also weren't too keen on Mir in the run-up to the socialist election in Chile. So it's not uncommon for communist parties to be very chary about rivals on the left, to be very, very fearful about new people coming into the family, and about being very concerned of losing their franchise. And I frankly think that a lot of this is going on, not only in relation to the election, but also in relation to the nature of the protests that they were engaged in. And in that, unlike all the other protests, the CP determinedly mobilized separately, right? And in a much more restrained way. Understandable in relation to Molotov cocktails, if you like, not so understandable in relation to the broader demonstration. It's not to say they didn't engage in them. Ernie's point about unions, I wanted to talk about that, but we didn't have much time. I have to say, I can't get it very clear. A lot of the union leadership have been very close to PASOK and extremely opportunist. Syriza is proud of the fact that it is closely related to what they call independent and new unions. Right? That said, a lot of the unions did mobilize for repeated but sporadic demonstrations against layoffs, closures, cutbacks, etc. But I get the sense, that, in my view, that the best people in Syriza think, as Sam does, that you would need a transformed labor movement for it to be much help to Syriza once it entered the state. You would need the type of unions that, rather than defending current practices inside the state, would be taking the lead in terms of trying to reorganize the state. And those unions, they feel, including in the public sector, are simply not interested or capable of doing that. So one of the things I think inevitably you'd have to get worried about if we were Syriza to form the government would be whether there would not only be a confrontation with anarchists and Antarsya left revolutionaries in the streets, but whether there might be a confrontation with public sector unions, not so much over cutbacks or layoffs, but over the reorganization of tasks inside the state, over modes of hiring that the unions are certainly complacent about in terms of patronage, hirings, etc. So this is a big dilemma that I think, as we build over the next 20 years, is one of the things that needs addressing. And that I must say, I don't think the Communist Party at all addresses. It doesn't even contemplate addressing. The general view of any serious Marxist intellectual I met is that the Communist Party is dead from the shoulder up. That it has a lot of cadre, it's very impressive in terms of its ability to maintain an organization, motivate a cadre, etc., but that it's dead from the brain up. And I think that's probably true. The final point on why austerity, in very narrow terms, as I said, I think it's about trying to keep the German and French banks from not losing too much of their investments. They've written off most Greece for the most part, but they're afraid that if Greece sets an example, the same thing might happen in terms of the private banks in Germany lent all this money to Spanish banks. And that's how the Spaniards were able to sustain their enormous trade deficit, very small fiscal deficit, all through the last decade and a half. So I think it's a very narrow and instrumental concern. That said, it's an ideological dynamic that goes on as well, which is that you need discipline. And I think you're absolutely right, it isn't just a matter of fiscal state discipline, but it's above all class discipline. It's workers' discipline. It's ratting down wages in the underdeveloped part of Europe. And the theory behind it, and it obviously can't hold for most underdeveloped capitalist states in the world, although it is working for some of them, including China and the other NICs, and to some extent, some maybe Brazil and Chile and Argentina, although having big resources is a big factor there. There is a theory that if you knock those wages down enough, you'll be able to attract foreign direct investment, and Greek workers will be able to compete with Vietnamese women on $1 a day. Right? Now, that is a dynamic that you could say is working for Poland. And Poland has become the hinterland, like Canada, for German foreign direct investment and for cheaper but quite high-end production. That imagining that happening in Greece by virtue of this kind of austerity program is ludicrous. And the main reason for investments in Poland in any case is not because they've knocked Polish wages down, although they have to some extent. Anything like, as you're saying, by 2/3, that would make this viable. So I think there's a high element of irrationality in the current capitalist crisis that capitalist states and capital itself are showing. It's not so surprising from capital itself, it's perhaps more surprising from capitalist states. And I think, as usual, the American state is much more rational about this and takes responsibility more for keeping global capitalism going, for geostrategic reasons as well as for economic ones, than the German state, which has always been extremely blinkered in terms of its fear of inflation, Hayekian commitment to discipline. People used to say that when the rest of Europe was reading Keynes, the Germans were reading Hayek. And they meant that for the late 40s and the early 50s. So I think there's a high element of irrationality in that, as well as narrow bankers' instrumentality. It's the only thing that can explain this, because this is not going to get Greek development. Obviously, it's not going to do that, but they don't give a shit about Greek development.
Wow. Thank you.